September 1945, Fort McCoy, Wisconsin. Japanese female POWs were stunned when they were invited to a church in America. Corporal Eiko Nishida expected humiliation. She braced for interrogation. Instead, she was led past the barbed wire gates into a small wooden building. The guards enforced strict Geneva Convention rules, but this was something else entirely. She had been told the enemy was monstrous, a force of pure cruelty. Yet inside, American families waited with open hymnals, and organ music filled the air. In that moment, a terrifying new truth began to form. The propaganda that had shaped her entire world was a lie. If your enemy offers you dignity when you expected only brutality, is it an act of mercy or a test you are about to fail? Tell us where you're watching from, and the time there. We want to see how far these accounts travel. If preserving dignity in history matters, subscribe to keep these stories alive. The organ music was the first impossibility. It flowed from the open doors of the small wooden church, a sound so profoundly out of place within the barbed wire confines of Fort McCoy that it felt like a hallucination. Corporal Eiko Nishida, age 24, stood frozen with the other Japanese women, nurses, clerks, and a few Red Cross staff captured years earlier. The war had been over for weeks, but the war inside them had not. They had been marched from their barracks, expecting another interrogation, another head count, another reminder of their powerlessness. Instead, they stood before a house of worship. The guards from the 430th Guard Battalion, men who enforced the rules with a firm but distant professionalism, now motioned them forward. The Americans were waiting. Not soldiers, but civilians. Farm families from the Wisconsin countryside, their children dressed in their Sunday best, sat in the pews. Their faces held no malice, only a quiet curiosity. They held hymnals, not stones. As Eiko and the others hesitated at the threshold, an American man in his 50s stepped forward. He wasn't a soldier. His suit suggested he was the pastor. He didn't shout or sneer. He simply bowed, a gesture of respect so shocking it felt like a blow. He gestured to the empty benches. In that moment, Eiko realized something truly terrifying. The propaganda that had been the foundation of her world, the stories of monstrous, cruel Americans who would spit on them and defile them, was a lie. Everything she had been told about the enemy could not be true, not here. Their journey to this impossible Sunday morning had begun 3 years earlier in the smoke and ruin of the Philippines. Eiko and many of the other women had been captured on Corregidor in 1942, serving as nurses and typists for the Japanese Imperial Army. They were among the 513 Japanese nationals, both men and women, who were eventually shipped to the United States under the War Department's prisoner of war program. Their long transit across the Pacific took place in the belly of the USS General John Pope, a voyage shrouded in fear and uncertainty. They landed in California in 1944, were put on a guarded train, and sent deep into the American heartland, to the sprawling military post of Fort McCoy, Wisconsin. Life in the camp had been the first crack in the myth. They were not sent to factories to be shamed. They were not starved or beaten. They were housed in barracks with coal-burning stoves that kept out the brutal Wisconsin winter. They were given 3 meals a day, their rations identical to those of the American soldiers guarding them. The U.S. Station, Army Military Police of Company B were strict, but they meticulously followed the rules of the Geneva Convention. Another nurse, Haruko Tanaka, had started keeping a secret diary on the back of a Red Cross medical form. She was more outspoken than Eiko, quick to voice the confusion they all felt. One of her first entries read, "The guards smile, they laugh with each other. I fear a trick." Small privileges were granted that felt like traps. They were allowed to form knitting circles, their hands given yarn and needles instead of being bound. They were offered English classes, as if the enemy wanted them to understand their own humiliation more clearly. Supervised walks were permitted, where they could see the vast, rolling green hills of a country they were supposed to despise. To women conditioned by the unforgiving harshness of the Japanese military, where a single mistake could earn a brutal punishment, this humane treatment was a constant, unnerving paradox. A few weeks after the war ended, Haruko wrote another entry. I dream of being sent to a factory to be shamed. Instead, we are told tomorrow is worship. The invitation had come from the camp's chaplain, under Army Special Services policies established in 1945. These policies permitted prisoners of war access to religious observance, as long as it was voluntary. To the American chaplains, it was a way to demonstrate their nation's values, a quiet counteroffensive against the very indoctrination that had convinced these women they were less than human. Now, inside the church, Aiko watched as one of the younger prisoners was handed a Bible. The book was bound in dark leather, and to her astonishment, the text inside was Japanese. A small American girl with blonde pigtails, no older than 7, stepped away from her mother and timidly offered one of the women a peppermint candy. The woman took it, her hand trembling, and then she did something no one had seen her do since their capture. She smiled. It was a small, fragile expression, but it was there. For Aiko, watching from her seat on the smooth wooden pew, the world tilted on its axis. The organ hymn, the Japanese Bible, the child's simple gift, these were not the actions of monsters. They were the gestures of people. For one fleeting, terrifying moment, the heavy armor of fear and hatred she had carried for years simply fell away. Mercy had replaced it, and she had no idea what to do. But the warmth of the church and the sweetness of the peppermint did not last. Back in the barracks, the old fears crept back in. The propaganda that had been drilled into them for years was a stubborn poison, and it whispered that such kindness could not be real. It had to be a trick. Not all the prisoners had been swayed. Aiko, ever cautious, turned to her bunkmate that night and said what many were thinking. If they can give candy, they can also give poison. The act of mercy, so stunning in the moment, was now being dissected, examined for flaws, for the hidden hook. Rumors swirled through the women's quarters like smoke. Perhaps this was a new, more sophisticated form of shame. They would be shown this kindness, their guards would photograph them smiling, and those pictures would be used to prove to the world that Japanese women were weak, easily broken, and disloyal. The church service wasn't a gift, it was a weapon. The suspicion was not entirely unfounded, though the threat came from a different direction. Outside the wire, some of the local Americans were outraged. The idea of enemy women being welcomed into their church, sitting in the same pews where they prayed for their own sons fighting overseas, was an insult. Letters of complaint appeared in the La Crosse Tribune in October 1945. One resident wrote, "Why should they hear the gospel when our boys lie in graves overseas?" The pastor, William Harding, who had lost his own nephew in the Pacific, had to defend his actions to his congregation. He stood before them not with anger, but with a heavy heart, and explained that if they did not practice the mercy they preached, especially in peacetime, then they had to ask themselves what their sons had truly died for. The mercy was on trial, both inside and outside the camp. Months later, as the winter of 1945 gave way to a new year, the women were told they were finally going home. In early 1946, they were transported back to the coast and boarded the USS General Gordon for the long voyage across the Pacific. The journey back was different. The fear of the unknown was replaced by a nervous hope. They carried with them the strange, conflicting memories of their captivity, the discipline of the guards, the warmth of the barracks, stoves, and the haunting, impossible sound of an organ in a Wisconsin church. They landed at Yokohama, a port they had left in a time of imperial strength and confidence. What they returned to was a landscape of ghosts. The city was a ruin of twisted metal and charred wood. Hunger was a constant, gnawing presence. The Japan they had fought for was gone, replaced by devastation and the quiet authority of their American occupiers. But the deepest shock was not the physical destruction. It was the welcome they received. They were not greeted as heroes who had endured. They were met with suspicion, with sideways glances and hushed whispers. They were the ones who had survived, the ones who had surrendered. In the eyes of many, that made them collaborators, women tainted by enemy kindness. The story of their treatment, of the church service, was not a testament to their endurance, but a mark of their shame. Aiko's own brother, a soldier who had lost a leg in the fighting, saw her not as a sister returned from the dead, but as a disgrace. He looked at her with cold eyes and spat the words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "Better you had drowned at sea." In that instant, the memory of the church curdled. The peppermint candy tasted like ash. The kindness that had felt like a miracle in Wisconsin now felt like a profound betrayal. It was a brand, marking her as different, as dishonored. The simple act of mercy had saved her body, but it had poisoned her return. Could mercy ever be trusted if your own people called it a stain on your soul? For decades, there was only silence. The women who returned from Fort McCoy buried their stories deep inside, locking them away like shameful secrets. The diaries, like the one Haruko Tanaka kept on scraps of paper, were hidden in the bottoms of drawers, their ink fading along with the memories they held. In the New Japan, a nation struggling to rebuild its body and its pride, there was no room for their narrative. The country wanted stories of men's heroic sacrifice, of soldiers who fought to the last breath. The story of women who had surrendered, survived, and been shown mercy by the enemy was an uncomfortable one. It did not fit the myth of glorious defeat. And so, the women learned not to speak of it. The memory of the Wisconsin church, with its organ music and peppermint candies, became a private ghost. They married, raised children, and grew old, carrying the weight of an experience they could share with no one, not even their own families. The years turned into decades. The 1,950 seconds brought reconstruction, the 1,960 seconds brought economic miracles, and the 1,970 seconds brought a new generation that knew little of the war's complexities. The women of Fort McCoy became grandmothers, their hair turned gray, and the silence held. Then, in the 1,980 seconds, nearly 40 years after the war had ended, a key turned in a lock thousands of miles away. In a local archive in Wisconsin, researchers piecing together the history of Fort McCoy stumbled upon a dusty church ledger. There, in neat cursive, was a single-line entry that had been overlooked for decades. It recorded the attendance for the service on the 23rd of September 1945, and it noted, "Japanese POW women attended." This small, forgotten fact was a crack in the wall of silence. The researchers began to dig deeper, uncovering military records from the 430th Guard Battalion and the Army Special Services policies that had allowed for the service. They started a quiet search for the women themselves, a difficult task that spanned continents and the fog of time. Slowly, cautiously, a few of the survivors were found. At first, they were hesitant to speak. The habit of silence was strong. But when presented with the proof, with the simple fact that their story was not just a memory but a documented event, the words began to come. They were not grand speeches, but quiet testimonies, spoken in hushed tones. One woman, her voice fragile with age, remembered the hymn. "I never forgot the hymn," she said. "We were given dignity when we had none." The words were a revelation. What they had been forced to see as a source of shame was now being reframed as an act of humanity. The memory was not a stain. It was a lifeline. Aiko Nishida, now an old woman, finally shared the story with her granddaughter. She spoke of the fear, the confusion, and the overwhelming shock of being treated not as a prisoner, but as a person. The shame her brother had cast upon her had defined her for so long, but time had given her a different perspective. In America, she told her granddaughter, her voice clear and steady, "I was treated as a human. That is what I carried back." In her final years, the memory of that Sunday morning returned to her not as a source of pain, but as a source of profound clarity. She could see it all: the polished wood of the pew, the unfamiliar faces filled with a calm welcome, the sweet, sharp taste of the peppermint melting on her tongue. She could hear the sound of the organ, a hymn sung in a language she did not understand, but whose message of peace she felt in her bones. She had once thought it was a trick, a clever form of cruelty. Decades later, she finally understood it for what it was, the one act that had restored her belief in a shared humanity long before the war was officially over. The weight of that memory was a strange and solitary burden, For years it remained locked away, a story too complex for a world that saw only black and white, enemy and friend. The women who came home from Fort McCoy scattered across a recovering Japan, carrying within them the quiet contradiction of their captivity. They learned to live with the ghosts of their past, the ghost of the soldier they were trained to be, the ghost of the prisoner they became, and the most confusing ghost of all, the memory of an enemy who showed them grace. In the grand narrative of post-war Japan, their experience was an inconvenient footnote. The nation was building a new identity from the ashes, one that celebrated stoic endurance and tragic sacrifice. There was little appetite for stories of survival that involved the kindness of their conquerors. It was easier to forget, and so the women complied. They folded their histories into small, neat squares and tucked them away. The secret diary Haruko Tanaka had risked so much to keep was hidden at the bottom of a chest, its pages growing brittle with unspoken truth. The hymn from the Wisconsin church faded to a melody without words, a tune that might surface at odd moments, only to be pushed back down. They became mothers and grandmothers, their lives measured in seasons and family milestones, the years in America, a distant, murky chapter they chose not to reread. The silence stretched across decades, a vast, unbroken expanse. But history is patient. It holds its secrets until someone is ready to listen. In the early 1980 seconds, in a small county archive in Wisconsin, a pair of local historians were meticulously working their way through the wartime records of Fort McCoy. They were not looking for a profound story of mercy. They were simply documenting the camp's role in the war. Poring over old ledgers, they found an entry in the chaplain's log from the 23rd of September 1945. The handwriting was plain, the entry brief. It noted the day's attendance and, almost as an afterthought, a single line: Japanese POW women attended service. It was a simple statement of fact, but for the historians, it was a spark in the dark. They cross-referenced it with POW rosters and transport manifests from the War Department. They found the names of the women, the designation of their units, the record of their long journey from the Philippines to the American Midwest. The quiet act of kindness, performed by a small congregation and a thoughtful pastor nearly 40 years earlier, had not vanished. It had been waiting, preserved in ink on aging paper. The search began to connect the records to the living. It was a slow and delicate process, a bridge of letters and translators built across the Pacific. Many of the women had passed away. Others were reluctant to revisit a past they had worked so hard to bury. But a few, now in their old age, agreed to speak. Their testimonies were not dramatic retellings. They were quiet, fragmented recollections, pieces of a puzzle they themselves had not fully assembled. One woman remembered the shocking sight of the children in the pews, their faces open and curious, not filled with the hate she had been taught to expect. Another spoke of the warmth of the stove in the barracks, a simple comfort that felt like an impossible luxury. Haruko Tanaka, her diary finally brought into the light, confirmed the deep suspicion that had followed the church service, the fear that it was all a cleverly staged deception. But it was Aiko Nishida who gave the memory its final, enduring meaning. Late in her life, sitting with her granddaughter, she finally unlocked the story she had carried alone for so long. She described the walk to the church, the weight of her fear, and the disarming sound of the organ. She spoke of the pastor's bow, a gesture that had undone years of indoctrination in a single moment. In America, she said, her voice soft but sure, I was treated as a human. That is what I carried back. The shame that her brother had branded her with had faded with time, replaced by a deeper understanding. The kindness she had received was not a trick, nor was it a betrayal. It was simply the truth. They had been told they were beasts. In a Wisconsin church, they were treated as neighbors. That memory, fragile but bright, endured longer than the war.